This video is sponsored by Epic Basing. Now, I'm as guilty as the next person of just doing really simple bases for my miniatures. But what if I could show you how to go from this to something like this? Or even this? Or why not put some marines on there for good measure as well? These raptors look fantastic. All of the components I've used on these bases are from this video sponsor, Epic Basing. A huge thank you to them for the sponsorship. So let's get into the nitty-gritty, and I'll show you how to achieve these results really quickly and really easily. So the first thing I need to do is take these off my 3D printer. I have a Uniformation GK2. This is what they look like straight out of the vat. Now it's time to give them a bath in the isopropanol solution in my Uniformation wash station. And then once they're dry, we've got our first proper look at them. Now I like to take the supports off at this point before I cure them. There will be one or two left over, but that's okay. I want to get rid of the most of them. And I'm wearing gloves because this resin still isn't fully cured. Use protection, folks. Then it's into the curing station, a quick 5 minutes. And now these are fully cured, ready for painting. Look at all of these different basing components. There are so many things. We've got damaged columns, damaged concrete, sandbags, girders. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, hang on a minute, I haven't got a 3D printer, so what relevance has Epic Basing got to me? Well, good news, my friend. Epic Basing not only do STL files, but they also sell resin versions of all of the bits that I'm using in this video, and many, many more. Just check out their website at epicbasing.com. And you've got loads of different options, such as grass tufts, rocks, bushes, an enchanted forest, and you can add them all together, mix and match, and get some really fantastic and unique bases. I'm really, really impressed with how some of these have come out. I'm loving using them. So hopefully we'll be doing some forest bases soon, and I can use some other parts that you can check out there. So don't forget, go to epicbasing.com. You can either get the STL files or you can get the hard copy resin versions. Now, not only do I have enough pieces here for the bases I want to make, I've got loads of spares as well for my bits box. And of course, I can print as many copies of these as I want because I've got the STL, which is great for making sure I've got uniformity across my army. So let's have a look at how we build these bases up. So the first thing we do is just pick a few components. Now, it's very easy to get carried away here, but do remember we are going to be putting a model on this base as well. So don't just cover it off completely. And we do need to consider having some flat areas where the feet are going to be. But as this is resin, I'm just using a little bit of super glue to glue it to a normal plastic base. This is quite fun, actually, getting all the parts to fit. It's a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle. And I'm really, really enjoying this, going for, like I said, a nice disrupted urban theme. Now, once that super glue is completely dry, you may notice there's a little bit of a gap when it comes to the basing elements and the plastic base. So we need to fill that in. We've got a couple of ways of doing it, and I'm going to do it using some of this coarse texture paint from Pro Acryl. And I'm going to mix this into the worst areas. I'm then going to use some more finer texture paint. I'm going to use Astrogranite from Games Workshop. The colour doesn't matter because we're going to prime over this when it's dry. Now, if you don't have these paints, you could potentially use something like PVA glue with some coarser rock basing material and some fine sand. That'll work just as well. I'm using this because I want it to dry fairly quickly. I'm going to work my way across the bases. You can really see this is starting to tie it all in together quite nicely. And because we're using texture paint, it's going to make it nice and easy for us to paint them effectively as well. So there we are. I've built some bases. I've added that texture paint to tie them all in together, and I've primed them with black primer. I've used matte black from the Colourforge, and you can see that this looks really, really nice. So let's not hold back any further. Let's get painting, and I'll show you how you can really transform these elements. The first thing I'm going to do is take some Steel Legion Drab, and I've thinned this down quite a bit. I'm going to use this to paint things like sandbags and pillars. Now, I'm not using it to paint the concrete path. I'm going to paint them a different colour so we can get some variation in. So I'm just slopping this on and making sure it doesn't go on too thickly, but I'm not overly concerned about how well this covers. Once that's completely dry, I'm going to go in with some Karak Stone. I'm going to do exactly the same. Now, this is quite thin. It's a much brighter colour than the Steel Legion Drab underneath, but it's going to give me a nice effect. Again, I'm not worrying too much about the coverage. I just want to stipple it on using an old brush. Now, before we do this next step, it's really important that Karak Stone is dry. I'm using a hairdryer in between steps here to help speed the process up a little bit. Next up, I'm going to take some Gryph Charger Grey contrast paint. Now, the reason I'm using Gryph Charger Grey is because I couldn't find Space Wolves Grey. I've lost it. But this is more green than the Space Wolves Grey, which is what I'd use normally. But I think it's worked out okay. Now, I'm popping this on and then I'm just putting a little bit of contrast medium over the top of it to sort of thin it out on the model and get it to really flow into those recesses. When that's all dry, and it's really important that it is dry, I'm then going to go back in with some Karak Stone. And I'm using a chunky Artis Opus Series D dry brush for this. You can use any kind of brush that's got a decent size head on it. And this is not quite dry brushing, but I'm definitely stippling it, focusing it along the tops of the areas so I get a little bit of a transition going on so it's slightly darker towards the base. The next step is to do exactly the same using some grey cere. However, what I am going to do with this is start to drag the brush across the sharper edges. This is going to start to highlight it. So we're going to build the paint up a little bit towards the top, but we're also going to highlight the edges towards the bottom and across the top, which is going to help us increase the contrast. Finally, I'm going to use some pure white paint. Now, I'm using AK white for this. Use whatever white paint you've got. If you've got white scar, bold titanium white, it's all good. Not too much on your brush. And generally, we're just going to flick this across the sharpest edges to get that nice pronounced highlight that's going to stand out on the table. Now, to do the rust, I'm using this new product, which is called Fresh Rust from Warpaints Fanatic. And the reason I'm doing that is because I don't think that my traditional method will work on these bases. Normally, I like to put some Typhus Corrosion down, let that dry, and then dry brush it with orange. However, I think these are a little bit too fragile for that, so I need something else. And this actually does the job perfectly. It's a nice bright orange, a little bit like Skrag orange, and it's got some nice texture in it. And all I'm going to do is paint this over all of the steel rebar and any other elements that I want to be rusty. I'm being a little bit careful, but if I do spill a little bit, it's not the end of the world. Once that's completely dry, we need to shade it a little. And the colour I'm going to use for that is Strong Tone. Again, the new Army Painter Fanatic. If you haven't got this, you can use Agrax Earthshades, absolutely no problem. Again, I'm just painting over all the steel rebar, but I'm not being hugely careful when it comes to the stonework. If I get it onto some of the main faces, then I am going to wipe it off. But if I get it into the recesses, in particular if I get it onto the internal stonework, I'm absolutely fine with that. So when that's completely dry, it's time to add some rust streaks. Now, there's an argument to be said here that you should use something like oil paint or enamels, and they are easy to use, but I do want to show you how to do it using acrylics. It's really quite simple. All we need to do is take some Skrag Brown paint and thin it down quite a lot with water. So maybe 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part paint. And we're going to make sure it's well mixed in, and then we're going to take most of it off our brush. I'm then going to stipple it around areas of the stonework where that rebar is. I'm just going to make sure it gets into the recesses. When it comes to painting the stains, that's really simple as well. All you need to do is just dab some onto the rockwork, clean your brush off in some water, wipe it so it's not very wet, and then just quickly clean away some of the edges of the acrylic, and you get a really nice subtle rust effect. So let's go on with the rest of the stonework. So first thing we're going to do is take some Mechanicus Standard Grey. I'm being very liberal with this because I do want to bridge the gap a little bit between the lighter colour and the darker grey. And where I have that transition, I'm going to clean my brush off and just stipple it with some water to help it seep in and add a little bit of interest. When that's dry, I'm going to take some Null oil and shade all of the area I've just painted grey, particularly focusing this on the recesses. I'm then going to go back to Mechanicus Standard Grey and start to stipple this back over the rocks. I've let the Null oil dry, and I'm going to focus this towards the edges and really start to build up this highlight. I'm then going to go to Dawnstone and do exactly the same thing. Now, I'm not waiting for the Mechanicus Grey to dry completely, and the Dawnstone is thinned a little bit. As you can see, I'm just stippling it with an old brush. I'm not worrying too much about whether it flows into the recesses accidentally. I just want to build up that texture. The final 2 steps are to take some Administratum Grey and stipple it. Again, I'm using one of my Artis Opus Series D dry brushes for this. I'm stippling it in a vertical motion, slowly building up that texture and that coverage. Again, the last step is with some pure white paint, again with AK white for me, and I'm looking to catch those edges, but also stipple it to kind of simulate where you may have got scratches and little just where ricochets have perhaps hit it. Some little streaking like that is quite effective. To add a little bit of interest, I'm going to do two things. Firstly, I'm going to take some Athonian Camoshade and paint this onto the base. Now, my Athonian Camoshade is pre-thinned with contrast medium. It's probably a mix of 50-50, so it's 1-to-1. But if you haven't got this, don't worry. All you need to do is just pop it down, clean your brush off, and then just feather the edges so you get that little bit of a green hue, which just adds some interest. The second thing we're going to do is take some Typhus Corrosion, and we're going to paint this around the bases of the stonework. And like we've done throughout this, we're going to stipple it onto those areas. We're going to clean our brush off, make sure it's not soaking wet, and then we're just going to feather those edges. And what we'll start to see is we get a really nice, dirty transition effect that actually looks quite effective. And in terms of the effort we've made, it's very, very minimal, but it does look good. For the sandbags, if I've made any mistakes, I'm going to rebase them with Steel Legion Drab, and then I'm going to take some Baneblade Brown. Now, the Baneblade Brown is quite a thin paint anyway, and I'm just going to paint some vertical strokes across it, not worrying too much if it covers. I'm not concerned about that at all. What I want to do is simulate the build-up of texture. I'm then going to take some Karak Stone and do exactly the same thing. Now, because this is thin, it'll go down quite bright, but as it dries, it'll blend into the layer underneath. Now, I'm not, again, taking particular care with this. I just want to build up that texture. And the final thing I'll do is with a little bit of Flayed One Flesh, making sure I'm a little bit more deliberate with this, so I'm only putting it onto the areas that catch the most light. But again, it will blend down into the layer underneath. So there we go. I've shown you how to go from this to this. And yeah, I've got some models on there as well. I'm really happy with how these have come out. Thank you so much to Epic Basing for sponsoring the video. I can't wait to print more of their stuff and actually get these on my bases with my models. I think they're perfect for these raptors. And yes, you're probably thinking that you've seen these raptors somewhere before. I painted them in this video here, and I'll show you how to do it really, really quickly. Just click that link. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.